Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to be making a response video of sorts, which isn't something I've ever done before, so please bear with me. The person I'm going to be responding to today is, of course, the fabulous LightningRapunzel. There's a link down there somewhere, if I can manage that. And it's a response to her video about the difference between historical Henry V and Shakespeare's Henry V. Okay. So, quite clearly there are pretty large discrepancies between Henry V in history, so the truth, if you will, and the version of him portrayed in the Henriad by Shakespeare. I mean, just, for one thing, Henry V in reality was an incredibly chaste and religious man. In Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2, not so much. I mean, if you've seen any of the Eastcheap scenes, you know that's not quite the Henry V that existed in reality. And so I suppose one question you have to ask is, why? Okay, so there's one pretty convincing argument, if you ask me, that simply Shakespeare didn't have the sources he needed to be able to write a historically accurate play. So his main source, well, that scholars believe to be his main source, is an early play called The Famous Victories of Henry V. It's of unknown authorship. I mean, there's been some somewhat spurious claims that it was actually a young Shakespeare himself that wrote it, but there's never been any proof to corroborate that anyway. The fact is, this play describes this riotous youth of Henry V as seen in Henry IV Parts 1, Part 2, and even to a small extent in Henry V. But it doesn't really have any factual basis, and there's a famous incident with Henry's altercation with the Chief Justice, which has become, almost living legend about the riotous, the rambunctious young Prince Hal. But actually, it's got no contemporary corroborators. It was actually first heard of from a man called Thomas Eliot in 1531, over a century later. So actually, it's believed that a lot of the stories about his riotous youth really came from political enmity. So his enemies came up with these stories. People much later, after you have the Wars of the Roses, the massive turmoil that erupts after, Henry V, Henry VI, the things that go wrong then, and that's why you get all these discrepancies in the history. And so that could be a reason why Shakespeare doesn't tell an accurate story of Henry V, because he just didn't really know. However, there's another argument, one which I find somewhat more compelling. Simply, it made the plays more exciting and thus more popular. I mean, think of it just simply. You've got the story of a very boring, possibly, to your average Londoner in the pits, man who doesn't really do much, he doesn't put out, he doesn't drink, he's pretty stead. Or you've got Henry V, you've got Prince Hal, rambunctious, likes women, likes drinking, goes off with Falstaff, exciting. And perhaps that's where the change comes about, because Shakespeare is a writer, first and foremost. He takes real things that happened, or things that he finds in histories and sagas, takes those plots and fleshes them out. He makes the characters more interesting, he makes the words more interesting, and that's, I think, a great gift of Shakespeare. And so it would seem to me that actually what he does with the story of Henry V is he makes it into something that would be worth being a play. He takes the great excitement of the battles against Hotspur, against Owain Glyndwr, of Agincourt, the famous battle of English history when we defeated the French, and he turns it into something much more engaging by creating a character who is not perfect at the beginning, but rises to be something great. It's an old story, but it's the one that works. You have, the rough diamond who comes good at the end. And so perhaps that's what it's all about. That is why Shakespeare changed the facts. I mean, regardless of whether or not it's a shrewd money-spinning tactic, it's still something that Shakespeare really does. He takes real things and makes them into quite fantastic plays. I mean, sometimes he doesn't even take real things. He takes other people's plots and transmutes them into something much greater than the sum of their parts. I mean, Hamlet, for example, comes from a much earlier kind of Nordic text called the Ur-Hamlet. He talks about a prince called Amleth, and he takes the story of a man who finds out his father's been killed and takes his revenge and has a happy ending and turns it into a tragedy. He amplifies it. He turns it into something really quite poetic and magnificent with the words. And so I think that's really what Shakespeare does a lot in the Henriade. I mean, there's actually quite a lot of true things in the Henriade. So Falstaff, in original versions of Henry IV Part 1 and 2, was actually called Sir John Oldcastle. Sir John Oldcastle is a real person. He had not been created by Shakespeare. He is someone that Shakespeare has drawn out of history. And that's the way that the Henriade and a lot of his other plays seem to work. He takes something real, something that people know, and he brings it into bas relief, fleshes it out, makes it into something fantastically exciting and engaging. So, Bataille d'Agincourt, the St. Crispian's Day speech, he's playing on something that really happened, the battle, and he turns it into high drama, high poetry, really. Upon this St. Crispian's Day, he creates an incredibly engaging and intense experience for, a playgoer. And so, I mean, that is, I think, one of Shakespeare's real talents, because there's stuff that's real in his plays. In Hamlet, there's a reference to a crowd of little Iases, which is actually a reference to a group of child players in London at the time who were rivals of the Globe. And so by threading through reality, severely altered reality, into his plays, he makes them more engaging, more real, more visceral. And that, perhaps, is why they are so popular, why they were so popular, and possibly why they still endure, because perhaps the history itself is not correct, but it's something, it's a link to the consciousness. It's that milieu effect, the effect of everything that surrounds you, and it comes into his plays. And so he writes with the nationalism that was going around at the time under Elizabeth I, and he turns it in, it's a story of someone in the past, but it's using present day feelings. And as such, he creates a play, this Henry V, this character who is entrancing to watch through his fantastic, once more into the breach, dear friends, speeches. And maybe that's why he did it in the end. Because he wanted to be a good playwright. And that was how, in the end, Shakespeare operated, bringing reality into poetry. Thank you for watching.